In this second episode with Emma Symington, we are solely focusing on Australia's flagship variety, Syrah. The Master of Wine gives her insights in the evolution of the Shiraz plantings in Australia, covers specific regions with particular styles, then highlights market trends on domestic and international markets. You can also get Emma's personal tips if you are planning to throw a surprising blind tasting on Australian Shiraz. So please enjoy this deep dive into the topic and subscribe to the show if you haven't done already, and share this episode if you want to help others to learn about Australian Shiraz from Miss Symington. Enjoy! Cool. So Emma, welcome to the show again.
Hello, thank you for having me again.
So today's topic is going to be Shiraz, or Syrah. In this case, rather Shiraz, probably. Maybe let's start with the question, how did Shiraz become the most planted variety in Australia? Because this is really the signature grape variety. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the grape on the continent?
Absolutely, yes. As you said, Shiraz is really synonymous with Australia. Today, it counts for about 30% of all plantings in Australia. So that's just under 40,000 hectares of vineyard in Australia. Just to give some context to that, I think there's about 60,000 hectares of Syrah in France. So France has significantly more than Australia does, but it really is Australia's calling card. Now, in terms of when it first arrived in Australia, records aren't exactly accurate, but we think it arrived somewhere towards the end of the 1700s or the very early part of the 1800s. So, well over 200 years ago now. And really, it very quickly became a popular grape variety in Australia. I think this is partly because those early regions in Australia, places like McLaren Vale, Barossa Valley, Hunter Valley, these are all regions that have warm Mediterranean climates, and that was a perfect grape variety to suit that sort of climate. So it was a grape variety that really found a lot of early popularity with those early grape growers in Australia, and sort of quickly spread across to many different regions. So, throughout the 1800s and through the 1900s, it gained in popularity. And by about 1970, it was the most planted grape variety in Australia, the most popular grape variety. And then what we saw through the 1980s and really in the 1990s is we had this huge export boom in Australia. And that's really when the world discovered Australian wine and fell in love with it. And Shiraz is one of the reasons a lot of people fell in love with Australian wine. So it found a lot of popularity in the export markets, and obviously therefore more vineyards were planted. And there was a pretty famous guy called Robert Parker in America. I'm sure you know him well, a very famous wine critic. And he particularly promoted the big, bold style of Barossa Valley Shiraz. So really quite intense, concentrated styles of wines. And a lot of those styles at this time in the 1990s really became cult wines and really helped sort of cement Barossa Valley's prominence as such an important region for Shiraz. Now, it has to be said, I'd say within the last 20 years, there's been quite a shift in terms of how Shiraz is grown and how it's made in some of these regions, and particularly places like Barossa Valley and McLaren Vale. So as I said, through the 1990s, a lot of these wines that were popular and promoted, particularly by Parker, were these, wines that the grapes were picked quite late. So, very ripe grapes, giving quite alcoholic wines, very concentrated and powerful in terms of style, and tend to have quite a lot of new oak. So these were really over the top kind of blockbuster style wines. And I think what we've seen in the last 20 years is actually a move away from that style. And now really the watchword is all about freshness. So people are picking a bit earlier, making much more restrained, elegant styles of Shiraz, certainly dialed back on the oak, so allowing that lovely fruit to come through, and in general getting a much more elegant style of Shiraz. So Shiraz really has gone on this kind of roller coaster journey, but absolutely is Australia's calling card.
Do we know where the oldest plantings in Australia still are, and how old are they?
Absolutely. Well, not only are they the oldest plantings in Australia, they're actually the oldest plantings in the entire world of Shiraz. They were planted in 1843, and they're in the Barossa Valley, and that is actually owned by the Langmile family now and go into their Freedom Shiraz. So those are vines that were planted, 180 years ago, and still producing grapes and making wine to this day. And it's not just that one single vineyard. There's a number of vineyards in Barossa, in McLaren Vale, also in the Hunter Valley, and in other parts of Australia, with vineyards of Shiraz that were planted in the 1800s, mid 1800s. So incredibly old vineyards. And it's something that's really, really special for Australia.
And I guess the lack of Phylloxera was also a great help for these vineyards. But
exactly.
How is the situation with Phylloxera now in Australia? Because I think in a couple of regions it started a little bit, right?
Yeah, so Phylloxera actually came into Australia towards the end of the 1800s, so a similar sort of time as it happened in Europe. And that happened in parts of Victoria. So some regions in Victoria very much have Phylloxera, and it's been there since then. But many parts of Australia are Phylloxera free. So the entirety of South Australia, the state of South Australia, Western Australia and Tasmania are all Phylloxera free. And I think that's, we've got to give a lot of credit really to the government at the time, particularly in South Australia. So when Phylloxera arrived in Victoria, which is its neighbouring state, towards the end of the 1800s, I think they had this incredible foresight to realise what this might mean for their vineyards, for their produce, for their land. And so they instigated a very, very strict quarantine law in terms of what came into South Australia, both in terms from other countries, but also across the state borders. So this has meant that Phylloxera has never got to South Australia. So, you know, the vast majority of vineyards there are still planted on their own roots.
You were already mentioning or touching up on the different styles and maybe already present trends, but I think Australia also has a very famous, almost like brand. This is this GSM blend, where Syrah is really a vital part in this blend, right? How is the evolution of maybe this blend, and how did it come about in this area?
Yeah, so GSM or SGM blends, you know, some of them are Grenache dominant, some of them are Shiraz dominant. It's again something that was prevalent in particularly Barossa Valley and McLaren Vale. So some of those very early wine regions in South Australia. And partly because those were the grape varieties that were planted there. So, you know, Shiraz, Grenache and Mourvedre, they were all grapes that came early into Australia in the early 1800s. They're great varieties that, as we know, sort of thrive in those Mediterranean climates. So, you know, really planted in these regions. And so as a result, people started making blends of them. And I think it wasn't really until kind of the 1980s, 1990s that these blends kind of became on the map. People became aware of them. Charlie Melton, at his eponymous winery, created the Nine Popes GSM blend, which he thought was, you know, a little pun on Chateauneuf de Pape. He got his French a bit wrong there. But that's one of those wines that really put the GSM blends on the map. And it is really a blend that is quite important for these regions.
Is it still continuing to be a vital part of some portfolios there? Or do you see the move away from that?
No, we still see quite a lot of GSM blends. Coming out of, yeah, as I said, particularly places like Barossa Valley and McLaren Vale. And I think it just gives wineries just, you know, a slightly different wine out of the grape varieties they have planted already. I think Grenache in itself is becoming a grape variety that's becoming more and more popular. You know, there's incredible old vine Grenache as well in these regions, and people are treating it in a slightly different way to make these much more elegant, restrained styles of Grenache. So you are seeing some of that come through into the GSM blends, you know, perhaps slightly more Grenache in the blend and giving you a sort of lighter, more medium-bodied style than perhaps you'd have had in the past when they tended to be quite overt and opulent styles.
And if we maybe move back to the Northern Rhone style, so a single variety Syrah, there are common practices in the world to increase the freshness in a Syrah, right? Maybe co-fermentation with Viognier, maybe whole bunch fermentation. Do you see that that kind of trend or movement towards these more fresher style in Syrah, and what are the maybe more common practices that are coming alive in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. We see both of those things happening in Australia. You know, there certainly is the Shiraz Viognier or Syrah Viognier blends, particularly in regions like Canberra, so a slightly cooler climate region where that blend seems to work really, really well. And absolutely, whole bunch is becoming really a key part of the winemaking technique for a lot of people, just giving that added freshness and a bit more structure as well to the wine. But it's hard in a way to talk about Australian Shiraz as a broad category because, we have to remember Australia as a country is far bigger than Europe. And there's 65 different wine regions in Australia, and 60 of those make Shiraz. So, and of course, within that, there's a huge diversity in terms of the style of wine that is made, and the climate and the topography and the soil type and everything else. So Australian Shiraz in itself is quite a bit of a misnomer because it doesn't really talk to the breadth and the diversity of the styles of wines you get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Dear friends, I have to talk to you about something really magical. The last 2 years were quite challenging for me, working at least 45 hours a week as a sommelier, planning our wedding, keeping my workout goals in check, and studying for the WSET diploma on the side. It was not unusual for me to feel sluggish, unfocused, and unmotivated even. But the last 2-3 months were much easier thanks to one product, Magic Mind. This little green drink is a tasty combination of 12 main ingredients, including mushrooms, nootropics, adaptogens, and vitamins, respectively. It was created by accomplished scientists, such as Dr. Andrew Weil. Maybe you know him from the Joe Rogan podcast. And besides boosting productivity, it even helps reducing daily stress with active ingredients like ashwagandha. So instead of drinking 8 espressi a day like before, I just had 1 shot of Magic Mind every day after lunch with 1 espresso, an hour before my study sessions. And I was back in the game, feeling sharper and more focused without the roller coaster effect of any other common stimulants. The awareness, better focus, and to be honest, even better mood has lasted into the late hours that work beyond 10 p.m. Even the taste is quite pleasant, especially if you keep it chilled in the fridge. I think everyone needs a push in his or her daily hustle, and I think Magic Mind could work for you just as well as it has worked for me. And if you want to get it cheaper than others, you can get a staggering 56% off your first subscription via the link in the show notes, or 20% off your one-time purchase if you use the code WINEGHOST20 in the checkout. That's WINEGHOST without the usual S at the end, 20 in the checkout. But you can find everything in the show notes. Now, back to Australia with Emma. So let's go to the more extremes or to the more niche regions, maybe. If you would name maybe the coolest climate and the hottest terroirs for Shiraz in Australia, so maybe the 2 extremes in terms of climatic conditions, and which regions would pop up in your mind that maybe also drive a little bit in the change of style also in the continent? Which regions or maybe even which producers should we have on our radar here and also in Europe to follow the evolution of the grape variety in Australia?
Well, talking about different climatic areas, I think the move towards more cooler climates, there's certainly a big increase in some of those cool climate regions for Shiraz or Syrah in Australia. So places like Tasmania, obviously best known for its sparkling wine, but actually there is a bit of Shiraz planted there, often labeled as Syrah, and, giving you that idea that these are very much the cooler climate styles. Again, Yarra Valley, so just outside Melbourne, down in the southern part of Australia, again, a cool climate region, and really making waves with some of its lovely, elegant, medium-bodied styles of Syrah. And I suppose I should just make a note here in terms of the designation or distinction between Shiraz and Syrah. And really, it's entirely up to the winemaker and the marketing team as to what they put on the bottle. Typically, we expect Shiraz tends to be used in slightly the warmer climate regions, so giving that slightly broader, more concentrated style of wine. Syrah tends to be used in the cooler climate regions, giving you that more restrained, medium-bodied style. But it's not a definite distinction, and there is some overlap between those 2 things. But it really is to give the consumer an idea of what to expect when they open the bottle. So in terms of, I suppose, the other end of the extreme in terms of temperature, I mean, Barossa Valley obviously is probably Australia's calling card for Shiraz. It is very much that warm Mediterranean climate, you know, hot summer days, colder winters, perfectly matched really to Shiraz as a grape variety, which is why it absolutely thrives there. But then some of the even hotter inland regions, places like Rutherglen, for example, which is particularly known for its muscat, you know, its fortified style of muscat. There's also some Shiraz there, and making that quite intense, concentrated style. So as I said, you know, there are all these very different regions with quite distinct characteristics, making different styles of Shiraz.
Is it possible to follow up the evolution of the style when one buys the subsequent vintages of the very classic Shiraz from Australia? So I don't thinking about Hill of Grace or Grange or Santarri Shiraz from Penfolds. So do you see that these are kind of the representations of how the style is evolving, or you should really maybe tiny or even newer producers to get the fresh breeze in your hair, so to say?
So those ones you've just mentioned, Hill of Grace and Grange and St Omri, are such particular wines. I don't think you've probably seen that huge change in them because they've kind of never needed to. I mean, in the style of Hill of Grace, it is its own style of wine. You know, when you taste that wine, it is what it is. It couldn't be anything else. It speaks of its vineyard site. It speaks of its incredibly old vines. And Hill of Grace is up in Eden Valley, so it is a cooler site anyway. So it's always had that sort of line of acidity and structure running through it. So no, I would say in terms of looking at the evolution of styles, I'd probably go down a bracket in terms of price range. And it's probably not something you'd notice necessarily vintage to vintage. But if you went back 10 years, you'd absolutely notice the difference. So it's been that gradual change, I would say, over 10, 20 years, rather than a vintage to vintage change, if that makes sense.
And if I would do a blind tasting on a Saturday night, not even in Europe, but also in the US. So basically, I'm talking about widely available wines. And if I would want to surprise my guests with a cool climate Syrah, so they maybe find themselves in the Northern Rhone or somewhere in Europe with a kind of cool climate, nose, and also maybe a slightly more sinuous body. Which Australian wines maybe should I pick for this tasting to get a very surprising element into my lineup?
Ooh, so many options, really. I suppose ones that I often include in tastings where, again, you're trying to change that perception or surprise people. Shiraz from Great Southern, so down in Western Australia. So there's a sub-region there called Franklin River, which does make this real medium-bodied, restrained style of Shiraz, sometimes labelled as Syrah, in that kind of earthy complexity. So Franklin's estate, off the top of my head, is, you know, a really top producer there, but there's a number of them. Canberra district is another one that's great to sort of surprise people. So tiny region, obviously based around Canberra, the capital city of Australia, but this is at high altitude. So the region sits between 500 and 800 meters in terms of altitude. So you have that impact of coolness because of elevation. And it is a region that tends to give these more medium body styles of Syrah, often labeled as Syrah. But alongside that, you often get this lovely kind of floral note coming through, which often surprises people. So, I mean, Clonakilla is absolutely the, you know, calling card, I would say, for Canberra district. And they do, you know, their top wine is their Shiraz Viognier. It's getting very expensive these days. It is absolutely incredible, and really is one of those wines that helped change perception, I would say, of Australian Shiraz, because it is so different to the more classic style. But they also produce a slightly more reasonable price bottle, which is their Hilltops Syrah, which is from a nearby region called Hilltops. Again, a nice one to go for. Otherwise, the Grampians, which is a region down in Victoria, sort of northwest of Melbourne, so the tail end of the Great Dividing Range. So here again, you have some influence of elevation, about 400 meters in terms of altitude. And the interesting thing about the Grampians is it's based on granite. And as we know from the Rhone, you know, granite and Shiraz or Syrah tend to go hand in hand. So it's a region that really is particularly well known for its fantastic Shiraz. But I think as an aside, the interesting thing about the Grampians, it's a region where you tend to get a lot of black pepper as a flavour coming through in the wine. So much so that back in 2007, at the time, no one knew where this black pepper flavour came from in Shiraz, Syrah, around the world. So the Australian Wine Research Institute did some research and based it at a winery called Mount Langy-Giran in the Grampians, because as a winery, it was particularly well known for this black pepper flavour. And they discovered rotundone, which is the flavour, the compound that gives this black pepper flavour. Of course, it's exactly the same compound that is in black pepper in your pepper grinder. So, you know, that was really important research that was done back in 2007. But just to mention it, because I think this is a flavour that a lot of people associate with cooler climate styles of Syrah or Shiraz. So seeking out something from the Grampians would also be a good idea.
Cool. Thanks for the tips. I've already taken some mental notes. So. And how do you see, because I was looking at some statistics in terms of sales from Australian Shiraz. In recent years, there was an upward trend in the price paid for bottled exports of Australian Shiraz. I also see that among my fellow sommeliers that they are looking for these kind of, or they are turning their head again towards the new world in terms of maybe old varieties, but new styles. So they want maybe refresh their portfolios. And I also see some of the European families maybe opening up new wineries in Australia. Also, less new oak is very prevalent, I think, among the newest styles. How do you see the maybe the future of Shiraz? Do you see still a great interest in the export markets, and also maybe in terms of consumers and maybe among producers that they want to stick to this variety and maybe experiment with it more? Or how is your perception of this?
Absolutely. I think, you know, Shiraz is not going anywhere anytime soon. As I said, it represents about 25%, well, in 2023 vintage, it did 25% of all the fruit that was crushed in Australia. So it's incredibly important to the country. But as I've talked about, it really has been on this journey. And I think that journey is by no means finished. You know, there's people constantly experimenting with it as a great variety, both in terms of in the vineyard and in terms of the winemaking. So I think we will see the style continue to evolve over time, which is great. You know, no one wants to rest on their laurels. Things should absolutely, you know, be looking for the next way to improve things. That all being said, from a consumer point of view, I think there is and will forevermore be the sort of consumers that love the big, bold styles of Shiraz, and that is totally fine. That's also people who love, you know, drinking that sort of wine from Argentina or France or Spain or America. So those people are never going to go away. So I think we might see in time more of a split in the terms of styles that are made. You know, some going for that big, bold style, some going for that more restrained, elegant style, with perhaps, you know, a little bit in the middle too. But I think it's a really exciting variety. And I think just seeing where it's come in the last 10, 20 years, you know, who knows what's going to happen in the future.
And also maybe one of the biggest advantages for a producer in Australia that they have this similar freedom as in the new world anywhere, basically, like in the US, that you don't have these strict rules in the appellations, right? Or strict basically as in Europe. Do you see that changing, or do you see that this is kind of one of the biggest cornerstone of the winemaking in Australia as well? So they or are they gonna get stricter maybe with regulations?
I don't see the regulations changing. I don't think there's any desire for that to change, both in terms of from the winemakers and producers or actually from the final consumer. I don't think there's a need, and really it gives, as you said, the winemakers and the grape growers so much freedom to experiment and change things, which is absolutely a positive. That being said, I think what we see from the grape growers and the winemakers side is more of a move to promote single vineyards and discover, sub-regions within particular regions, and really focus down into the soils and the microclimates where they are. And we're seeing certainly more single vineyards being named on labels than we had in the past. So I think there absolutely is that move to that microsite kind of spectrum and more interest in that side of things. But I don't think that's going to be done by any sort of legislation, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because here I'm living in Austria. I don't know if you heard about it, but I think it's been a topic for a decade now, probably, in this country, to distinguish between Premier Crus and Grand Crus. Do you see that in Australia this is only decided by the producer or by maybe a regional body, that what the soil and what the microclimate could bring to the table, or how the wine should be characterized by the microclimate, or this is basically up to the producer?
So there's a huge amount of research going on in various or many regions across Australia, looking into the soils, into the climates. I'll give you an example. In McLaren Vale in South Australia, they've done a huge amount of research into the soils and the geologies in the region. And what they discovered is there's something like 40 unique geologies, the bedrocks within the region. And on top of that, there's 19 different soil types, which is just so much more complex than we imagine, most wine regions in Europe, for example, have. So it's a very, very complex picture in Australia, mostly because it is such an ancient continent, so eroded over time, and that really has this absolute patchwork of different soil types. So it's something that is of key interest, I'd say, within regions, certainly from winemakers and grape growers, and there's research happening. Whether that will sort of eventually result in more sub-regionality, I don't know. And there is a governmental sort of department that regions can apply to if they want to have official sub-regions, which do exist in some places. For example, in the Adelaide Hills, just outside Adelaide, which is quite a big region, they have 2 official sub-regions, Lenswood and Piccadilly Valley. So they have gone down that route of designating particular sub-regions. Other regions haven't quite got there yet, but it is certainly something people are very aware of and are thinking about.
And maybe it's going to be a bit too geeky for some listeners, but how big of a topic is clonal selection in terms of Syrah in Australia? Do you see that the people are matching certain clones of Syrahs, maybe with certain soil types or microclimates, or it's not as popular or well-known among producers?
So I think the broader subject of clones is very much important to a lot of people, and it tends to be more talked about with varieties like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, where obviously there are a lot of different clones available. Now you have to remember, in Australia, there's a lot of early grapes, a lot of early grapevines. Genetic material came in the early 1800s. From then until about 1950, 1960, basically no new genetic material came into Australia. So everything that is in the ground between that time has, and we are going to get quite geeky now, in terms of epigenetics, has sort of adapted itself to the environment. So there's actually a lot of interest in taking macile selection from old vine stock and planting that, rather than necessarily going to more modern clones. And this is particularly the case with Shiraz, because there is such a breadth of amazing old vine stock in Australia. So yes, it is important, but I'd say it's less important than for something like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
And maybe also another geeky question, but in terms of vineyard management, because Australia and especially some of the hotter climates, what you already mentioned, like Barossa, are really famous not only because of their old vines, but because of their bush vines, right? Do you see that it's going to maybe, like in terms of new plantings, are some people who are planting bush vines, or do you kind of have to move to VSP trellising because of the labor shortage? I don't know how big of a topic is it in Australia, but I think in Europe, like right now, I'm learning a little bit more about the Douro Valley, and this is a really big topic, right?
Yeah.
There, because mechanization is very limited. So how big is this topic in Australia, and how are maybe wine growers reacting to that, if that's a problem?
Yeah, labour's an interesting topic, and obviously Australia being a country that's a long way away from anywhere else, and doesn't have a huge internal population given the size of the country, it is absolutely something that is of key importance for grape growers and winemakers, and many other industries, of course. When it comes to bush vines, I'd say it's probably more of a conversation with Grenache, really, than it is with Shiraz, because I think there's a lot of understanding now that bush vine Grenache, or bush vines, gives Grenache a certain characteristic, and it's a really important and good way of managing those vines. And because Grenache has become quite a popular and therefore quite a valuable grape variety to have, particularly in Barossa and McLaren Vale, actually new vineyards often are going in as bush vines now, with the knowledge that that will cost a certain amount of money to manage, but it is the best way to manage these vines. And that is the way that all those original very, very old vineyards were planted as bush vines. So you do certainly see that when it comes to Grenache. Shiraz, I certainly don't know of any new vineyards going in as bush vines. That's not to say it's not happening. I would imagine most Shiraz is going to be trellised in some way. Not necessarily VSP. A lot of people have more kind of broader, bushier vines, so you get more shading. Rather than necessarily VSP, but there's going to be a lot of different things going on. Cool.
Emma, thank you very much for your deep insider knowledge. I think these episodes, these 2 episodes that we already recorded, I think a really great help, not only for listeners who want to geek out on trellising and bush vines and selection, but also maybe a better understanding of Australia, and maybe also giving Australia a new face and a new image in terms of climates and styles. Where should people go for more information, just to keep up with Australia and Australian wines and the evolution of the continent?
So we, as Wine Australia, who I work for, we have our education website, which is australianwine.discovered.com. And there's a huge amount of information on there. So there's 28 modules now covering all the key grape varieties, the regions, and there's some broader topics as well. Like there's one on old vines, and there's one on sparkling wine, there's one on organics. And then within each module, there's a PowerPoint presentation you can download really and use as you see fit. There's a study guide. So particularly if you're studying for WSET, it's a really brilliant thing to go and grab. There's video content. All of our maps are available there. So there's a huge amount of information, and it's all freely available, and you can just download it and use it as you see fit.
Cool. Thank you very much. Actually, I'm going to do that as well.
Good to know.
Cool, Emma. Thank you very much. Would you like to add something?
I think that's everything for me. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a nice day.
Bye. Thank you.